Okay, well, welcome everybody to this, the fifth presentation in the series of presentations sponsored by the ANZ MRC and hosting the 2021 visiting lecturer, Dr. Jack Dowds. I wanted to say worshipful brother, Dr. Jack Dowds. Jack tonight would have been presenting face-to-face in Dunedin. Of course, he is not there because the actual tour we had to cancel because of COVID. And so what we have done is put on 6 presentations by Zoom, which are from Jack's excellent book, his tour book, called A Ramble Around the Pillars. There are, in fact, 8 talks, 8 presentations this, and I will be talking about that just a little bit later. So the way we're going to organize this is as follows. We give the floor to Jack for up to an hour. He's never taken that long, but that's his time. After which we invite you to unmute yourself if you wish to make a comment or ask a question, and we close our session by 9:30. That's right, it's 8:30, I beg your pardon. We started at 7. In other words, we will not go for longer than 90 minutes and then it's finished. If you can't wait to ask a question, in case you think you might forget it, at the bottom of your screen, if you put your pointer there, it says chat. And if you click on chat, you are able to write a question or a comment, which we will see as we go along. So, George, is there anything else that we need to say? Oh, yes. Do we have anybody here from the Dunedin Research Lodge? Is the master or the secretary here? Wave if you are. There's Alan Jackson, because I will invite, if someone from that lodge wishes to say a few words of thanks at the end, they are very welcome to do so. Let me just check that everybody is indeed muted. I think we are. And so, Jack, are you ready for your presentation? Are you ready to share screen?
I think so. Shall I do that now?
Yeah, I think you should. Let's give it a go and see if everything is fine.
Everybody's holding their breath there, Mike. Here we go. All right. We're nearly right, except for one thing, and that's that I can't see anybody at this point. So give me a second.
Don't worry.
Right, I think we're just about right. So
share screen, yeah.
Let's see how this goes. Everything's on the screen. It may not be the right size just yet, so we'll see how we go.
We can adjust it, but let's see if we can see what you've got. Here we go.
Perfect.
Perfect, Jack. It's looking good. And you're able to move through. That looks absolutely fine. I'm going to mute myself and the floor is yours.
Okay, so we're kicking off then? Right. Okay, well, hello, brethren. And it's my pleasure to do this penultimate talk tonight on a person who's a particular favorite of mine in the literary world, if not the Masonic world. You'll see why I said that in a few minutes. And it's a paper about Oscar Wilde and his less well-known father, Sir William Wilde. So we'll just get cracking along with that. I'm going to start the paper by presenting to you, first of all, Sir William Wilde, because I think that most people, while they will have heard of Oscar Wilde, and while some of you may have a reasonably detailed knowledge of him, it's less likely that you will have a knowledge of his father, Sir William. So the first slide that I'm going to put up is a picture of Sir William Wills Wilde. Sir William Wills Wilde was born in 1815, and he was born in Kilkeven in County Roscommon in Ireland. His paternal ancestors, though, came from Durham, where they were, in fact, builders. That's his ancestors on the patrilineal side, so to speak. And they were builders from Durham. His maternal ancestor was from an old Gaelic family called the Flynns. And Sir William's a very interesting chap. He didn't grow up poor and he didn't grow up over rich, but he had a very interesting childhood in quite a remote part of Ireland, and he made friends as a boy. He would go into the cabins, as they would have been called, of the ordinary people, and he got enthralled by some of the stories that they were able to tell him about the folklore and the mythology of Ireland. In fact, to the point where he himself became a very knowledgeable person and indeed a published author and genuine researcher in that area. His father before him was a doctor in Ireland, and very interesting because although he was a doctor, he didn't actually qualify, even though he was practicing. He didn't qualify and get something to hang on the damp patch on his wall, of which there would have been many, to say that he was a doctor. He didn't qualify till he was 50. And even then, when he qualified at Edinburgh University, he qualified on the basis of two people who knew him, wrote a sort of an affidavit saying that he was a jolly good sort and he had done a course in medicine, and he was just the very fellow to get a medical degree from the University of Edinburgh. I will be checking to see if any doctors I attend have a degree from Edinburgh, and I'll be looking into them in some detail. So anyway, so the father was a doctor as well, and eventually Sir William qualified. Well, not eventually, he qualified at a regular age as a doctor, having attended Trinity College. He became a specialist doctor. He became a specialist in ear, eye, nose, and throat surgery. And when he first qualified, he got a person. He came across a person who wanted someone with medical training to accompany them on a voyage of the Mediterranean, and off he went. And he went to the Mediterranean with his, let's call him an invalid, and he looked after the invalid while they were touring the Mediterranean, and particularly Egypt. He went on an 8-month cruise, and while he was away, he studied natural history of the area, and he studied Egyptology, and he wrote papers on those as well. He was something of a polymath. The next picture is him as well, without the facial fungus, and describes him as Sir William Wilde, the ophthalmologist, because he was such a respected medical person that he was eventually knighted. He opened his own hospital in Dublin called St. Mark's Ophthalmic Hospital, and he had a very successful practice. And you'll be surprised to know that he was assisted in his medical practice by his illegitimate son, who was also a doctor. I'll come to him a little later. And he was Henry Wilson. He didn't carry the Wilde name. So respected was Sir William that he was awarded an honorary degree from Uppsala University in Sweden. And he was awarded the Order of the Northern Star by King Carl XV of Sweden. To put the cream on the cake, he was appointed by Queen Victoria as something described as her oculist, not occultist, her oculist in ordinary. And he was actually the eye surgeon. Well, I suppose ear, nose, and throat as well, but particularly eye surgeon to Queen Victoria, and he received his knighthood in 1864. He was also, as if he didn't have enough to do, the editor of the Dublin Journal of Medical Science. And one thing I need to say here, getting a little plug-in for my home country. In those days, medical science and medical training was actually top class in Ireland, and people came to Ireland to visit the medical training facilities, and it was as good as any other medical training facility in Europe, better than many. So you can see that Sir William was a multi-talented person. While he was doing all of this, he studied genealogy, he wrote and studied folklore, and he also studied archaeology as well, the archaeology of Ireland, the Neolithic archaeology, of which there is plenty. One thing that and this is surprising for a doctor, one thing that's surprising about him is that he wasn't particularly worried about his own personal hygiene. In fact, one of the jokes that used to circulate around Dublin, and this joke is quoted by William Butler Yeats in his book, his autobiography called The Trembling of the Veil. One of the jokes was, why are Sir William Wilde's nails so black? his fingernails, why are they so black? And the answer was because he scratched himself. So people would talk about the fact he was a wee bit, in Ireland we would say, he's bugging. So, yeah, so very interesting for a doctor, but he was a good doctor, so I think we can forgive him for that. His better half, Lady Jane Francesca Wilde, was a poet, and a jolly good poet at that. Her pen name was Speranza. I seem to recall, George, that you lived in a road called Speranza Road or something. Speranza means hope in Italian. Jane was the last of 4 children of a guy called Charles Elgee, who was a Wexford solicitor. And somewhere in her family, there was Italian. In fact, she would say her name was a corruption of an Italian name, Algiti, I think it was written, and it was a corruption of that. Her father died when she was 3, and she was largely self-educated, but by the age of 18, she could speak 10 languages. Now, that Oscar was obviously a very intelligent man, and his family background was such that he could hardly be anything else. She was also, as I say, a very good poet and a fellow researcher of folklore and archaeology with her husband. Even if he was a wee bit of a lad for playing away from time to time, she seemed to be a lady of a forgiving nature. So she married Sir William in 1851, and she had mastered her languages by the age of 18. She married him in 1851, and she proceeded to have children. Oscar's older brother, William Charles Kingsbury Wilde, was born on the 20th of September, 1852. Oscar himself, 16th of October, 1854. And perhaps lesser known, Isola Francesca Emily Wilde on the 2nd of April, 1857. Unfortunately, Isola died at the age of 10. I think from meningitis. I'm not entirely sure about that. The oldest son, William, became a journalist as well and a poet. And of course, Oscar became the most famous one in the family. And he was a prolific writer of all sorts of things, plays, fairy tales, and poetry, etc. And the thing about Jane was, although she was Lady Jane Wilde, and she was fond of the title, she was also an Irish nationalist. You know, I sort of described to you before the idea of Anglo-Irish, and I don't want to bore you to death with that again tonight. I think we've labored that one long enough, but she was, and the family were Anglo-Irish, but she was a very ardent supporter of Irish nationalism. She was also a supporter of women's rights, and she was very active in those areas. Here's a rather interesting little cartoon of Sir William and Lady Wilde. Unfortunately, Sir William wasn't a terribly big fellow and not very robustly built. And as Lady Jane Wilde aged, she tended to get a bit broad in the beam. And that cartoon is a contemporary cartoon from the time, poking a little bit of mild fun at the Wildes. So they had the 3 children. He also had 3 children out of wedlock, including Henry. I'm going to mention something about his daughters out of wedlock in a minute, because the sad fact is his life had plenty of sorrow in it, and his 2 illegitimate daughters, whom he treated very well, had an unfortunate end. And there's the end there. If you look carefully at that screen, you'll see that the bottoms of those ball gowns are on fire, and they were attending a ball in one of the big houses in the area where they were living. And Emily and Mary by name, Emily's dress caught fire, and Mary rushed to her to try and put it out, and her dress caught fire as well. And they both perished in the flames. Now, the scandal, Sir William accused of rape. This is quite an interesting area, and it's got some resonance when we come to speak about Oscar's demise and his decline as well. So just bear that in mind. This scandal is a significant thing. You can see to the left of your screen a cutout from a paper of the time where it lists a woman called Mary Josephine Travers versus Sir William Wilde and Lady Wilde. And the story, one thing I need to say is when there was a court case of this nature, because the case started off as a libel case. When there's a court case of this nature in civil law at the time, if the wife was accused, the husband was automatically party to the court case as well, which is why his name is there. So what actually happened was that a fellow doctor of Sir William's had a daughter, Mary Travers, and the daughter had an ear problem, and Sir William was treating her for the ear problem. She was a young woman, a grown-up woman, but young. And she eventually, for reasons which we can perhaps discuss a little later, she decided to accuse Sir William of raping her while she was under the effects of chloroform. Such was her anger and annoyance that she wrote a pamphlet, and she called the pamphlet Florence Boyle Price, or A Warning. And it was the story of a girl named Florence who was put under chloroform by Dr. Quilp. You can imagine who Dr. Quilp might have been, and raped, and who was then given short shrift by Mrs. Quilp. And when she tried to, when Mrs. Quilp when Mary tried to appeal to Mrs. Quilp in this case, it was leaving no doubt as to what her target was. When she signed the pamphlet, she signed it Speranza. So that immediately tells you that it was Lady Wilde that she was targeting. Mary then sent copies of the pamphlet to the Wilde's friends and paid to have extracts of it published in the Dublin press. She was a pretty angry woman. She also began at that point badgering Sir William for money, and he refused to pay it. She then went and distributed the pamphlets outside the local theatre when the Wildes were attending. And at that point, Lady Wilde decided to complain to her father. And Lady Wilde was a bit wound up, and she told the father that the daughter was acting like a prostitute. So the thing is that the daughter got quite angry and decided to take a libel case, which is why it went to court. To give you an idea of what she might have been like, when she was previously trying to get more of the attention of Dr. Wilde, she was in the street and she decided to take a large swig of laudanum, at which point she began to collapse. And Sir William took her into an adjacent apothecary or pharmacy shop. It was called an apothecary in those days. And he took her in, and between him and the apothecary, they managed to get her brought round again. The funny thing about the shop that she went into, the apothecaries, it was mentioned in Ulysses because James Joyce used a bit of the story in Ulysses, and he talks about them going into the shop to buy the lemon soap that the shop kept. And believe it or not, if you go to Dublin today, you can visit that apothecary where Sir William Wilde resuscitated the young lady, and where Joyce had Leopold Bloom buying his soap. And guess what? It's not in apothecaries anymore. It sells secondhand bookshops and lemon-scented soap. So we're coming up to a little bit of Masonic stuff in a second. So Mary Travers then took the case, and the judge was not particularly impressed with her. But Lady Wilde was indeed found guilty of libel, and the judge gave an order for derisory damages of the princely sum of a farthing. Now that sounds like a good outcome, but it's not an outcome you'd want yourself, because all of the costs fell on the Wildes. And the costs in those days was £2,000, which in these days is £250,000. This court case actually destroyed Sir William Wilde, and he retired to the country, and he didn't really recover. He died at the age of 61. He's buried in Mount Jerome. If anybody knows Dublin, he's buried in Mount Jerome Cemetery in Dublin, and that matters to me because my wife's family are Dubliners, and that's their burial ground, so to speak. One of the old jokes in Ireland, when you meet a girl and you want to sort of ask if she wants to get together with you, perhaps marry you, you say to her, "How would you like to be buried with my folks?" So that's a little bit of a joke about it. Now, Masonic membership was actually a benefit to Sir William, believe it or not, in the court case. What you're looking at there on the screen is a little image of a grand ball held in Dublin by the mayor, the Lord Mayor of Dublin, and it's a ball held in honor of the Prince of Wales, who was visiting at the time. So the reason that Sir William's membership stood him in good stead was the judge became aware that even after the time that Sir William was alleged to have raped Mary Travers, he was still very keen to be in his company. And she was spotted a number of times at Masonic balls. So because Sir William was a Freemason and had been attending Masonic balls and such like, and Mary was accompanying him, the judge sort of took that into account to think that her case wasn't a very serious one. And in fact, he said, had this been a criminal case and not a civil case, it would be thrown out. So William was initiated into Shakespeare Lodge number 143 on the 12th of December, 1838. He was passed on the 16th of March, 1839, and raised on the 21st of June, 1839. His Masonic membership helped him, as I have described. He was in the chair of King Solomon in 1841, and he was also a member of another lodge called St. Patrick's Lodge. And just by chance, excuse me, I happened to be surfing the internet looking for interesting things about Freemasonry, and I came across something for sale, actually up for offer for sale. And it was a St. Patrick's Lodge jewel, which someone had in their family and they were wanting to sell it off. Of course, I didn't buy it, but there's a little image of the St. Patrick's Lodge jewel. So the point here is that Sir William, his life had quite a serious scandal, and he was a very serious member of Freemasonry, and it stood him in reasonable stead. We're now going to go on and look at his wayward boy, Oscar. Oscar, the truth is seldom pure and never simple, and that applies very well to Oscar Wilde. He was born in Dublin in 1864, and he died in a Parisian hotel on the 30th of November, 1990. His name was a wonderful name, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. The family, particularly the mother, wanted to give him a name that resonated with their ancient Gaelic heritage, which both the mother and the father had. Oscar was admired and feted by London society for his work and his wit. And unfortunately, a life which had begun with great promise ended in a tragedy of Greek proportions. He was eventually imprisoned, despised, and shunned for his libertine lifestyle. In his writing and in his life, he was also interested in folklore and the occult, and that was something which he shared with his father. He wrote fairy tales, amongst other things, and the little image on the left there is a well-known image, a banshee in Ireland. If you don't know what a banshee is, if she ever comes for you, you'll know all about it, and she'll make her presence known by the loud wailing noises that she makes. But fortunately for you, they attach to a particular family and they can't cross water. That's why ours has never come over here. So what about the decline of Oscar Wilde? That image that you see on the left is a cartoon that was in the press at the time. It says the sale of Oscar Wilde's effects. That's not what's happening there. That's the court case. But when he was found guilty, it's quite true. All the people to whom he owed money were round at the house before they could draw a breath, trying to get what they could in case they weren't able to get their money. So Oscar went to university, first of all, at Trinity College, Dublin. And then he went to university. When he finished at Trinity, he got a scholarship to go to Oxford, and he went to Magdalen College. That's not a mispronunciation. That's what they call it. It says Magdalen there, but it's Magdalen, pronounced Magdalen College, and that's the coats of arms of Magdalen College. Oh, just want to go back there a little bit. He joined, when he was at Oxford, he joined the Apollo Lodge. Later became called the Apollo University Lodge, but it wasn't called that when he joined. Fellow members, it was quite an upmarket lodge. Prince Leopold, who was the sixth son of Queen Victoria, was a member. And Leopold became the worshipful member of the lodge on the 22nd of February, 1876. Excuse me for a minute. And the very following day, he was made provincial Grand Master. Nothing like pulling a bit of rank, I think you'll agree. That's the Randolph Hotel in Oxford, where the University Lodge meets. Now, it's still there, and I think they probably still meet there. I'm not entirely certain. I think quite recently the hotel has changed hands and possibly has another name. But that's what it's been called for a long number of years, and that's where they have met. And that's the banner of the lodge on the right-hand side. It meets 6 times a year, which I think is very civilized. Oscar had a number of Masonic certificates, and you can have a look on the screen. I'm sorry they're not more clear, but that's 2 of his Masonic certificates. And he did his degrees plus the Mark Master degree, and he was a member of the Rose Croix. He also held the position of Inner Guard and Junior Deacon in his lodge, and he joined another lodge. He couldn't get enough of it. He joined another lodge, Churchill Lodge number 478. Unfortunately, the memorabilia that you're looking at there, plus other memorabilia, was owned by Oscar's son, Vivian Holland. Just hold that name in your head for a minute. Vivian Holland, that was Oscar's son. He lived in poverty after Oscar's demise, and he was forced to sell the heirlooms that he had from his father. And those certificates that you're looking at now are now in the hands of Mary, Lady Eccles, who lives in the USA. Just going back to Vivian Holland, Oscar's wife Constance, after he had his downfall, decided the embarrassment was such that she changed the family name for the kids' benefit, for the children's benefit, and the name was Holland. What you're looking at there is Oscar in the Apollo Lodge dress. I understand that Apollo Lodge still meets in that. It's called court dress, court as in royal court. And it's got the little knee breeches. It's got the silk stockings. It's got the little low-cut shoes. You can't see it here, but I believe they have silver buckles. And it's got a little tail frock coat. That particular dress is the one that Oscar Wilde wore when he was doing his tour of America. None of the Americans, I'm sure, would have known that what appeared to them to be some theatrical and affected costume was in fact Oscar sporting his lodge gear. So I think that's quite interesting. Now, when he was in his lodge, he made what's known as a faux pas, a big mistake. And it has to do, that's why the pillars are there. The faux pas has to do with the pillars. After his initiation, he was at the festive board, and he was asked to make a speech, and he did. Oscar was never a man known not to take the opportunity to have a few words. Unfortunately, his speech was a rather awkward one, mostly because he wasn't terribly knowledgeable as just a new initiate as to what actually Masonry was about. He was fascinated by the craft and all the degrees, and when he made his speech, he made reference to the pillars, and he said, "I have heard that St. J, meaning St. John, the Baptist, John the Baptist, was the founder of this order. I hope we shall emulate his life, but not his death. I mean that we ought to keep our heads." Now, it's very funny. John the Baptist got his head chopped off. Oscar's being humorous and saying, well, we should keep our heads. But he really believed that they were named after John the Baptist, and that provoked a great howl of laughter, according to the report that came out afterwards. And Oscar, I'm sure, was somewhat embarrassed. It was a little unkind, I think, of the lodge to do that on him, because the festive board was open to non-Masons, and I'm sure he was made to feel pretty silly. Now, Oscar, his life was a bit tumultuous. He suffered a lot of turmoil in his life, particularly to do with religion. And he was Anglican, of course, and he always had a hankering to be Catholic. In fact, that's a comment that he made. Catholicism is the only religion to die in. I can see that there's a reason for that. I'm not Catholic myself, but I can imagine that you could accommodate to that. This was his desire to be Catholic was fueled by the fact that he managed, God knows how, he managed to get a private audience with the Pope, Pope Pius IX, in 1877. I think it was set up by one of his very well placed friends. And the Pope said to him, "I hope that you may take a journey in life in order to arrive at the city of God." And those are the Pope's words to him. And this is something that resonated with Oscar. Concerning this caused him a conflict with Freemasonry, of course, and we've discussed, if you haven't attended some of the other lectures, the Pope's opposition to Masonic membership came into play, and it must have caused him a little bit of turmoil. He said to his friend Robbie Ross, "I would be awfully sorry to give it up," referring to Freemasonry, "if I secede from the Protestant heresy." And there's a rumor that he was actually baptized as a child as Catholic. His mother wanted them baptized as Catholic, the boys and possibly the girl. The father was opposed to it, and the mother had a Catholic priest friend, the Reverend Prideaux Fox. And Prideaux Fox is said to have baptized him as a child. So there's some compelling evidence for that. The other thing I want to say is Oscar was a very enthusiastic Mason, to the point where he incurred what you can only describe as insurmountable debt, acquiring all the gear, nothing but the best. But his actual Masonic career only lasted 4 years, start to finish. In fact, it only lasted for the time that he was at Oxford. But he retained his interest, and in some of his writings, he makes comments which are clearly informed by Freemason. So the Wilde family had lots of interests outside of their professions, and their interests were esoteric and cryptic interests. The father had esoteric and cryptic interests, as did the mother, as did Oscar Wilde's wife, and as did Oscar himself. He's known to have attended, maybe not being a full member, but he's known to have attended meetings of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. His wife Constance was sort of a paid-up member, and his older brother Willie was a member as well. And it was the preeminent Theosophical Society in the British Isles, and was popular at the time. Also a member was Conan Doyle and William Butler Yeats. I'll leave the discussion on Yeats till the final lecture, because I'm going to say quite a bit about that there. But Doyle was also a Freemason, and he belonged to Phoenix Lodge number 257, as well as being an honorary member of Edinburgh Lodge number 1 and Lodge Canongate number 2. So the Wildes were very much involved in that, and they would have been mingling with the likes of Conan Doyle. And there, just out of interest, is a certificate which was given to Conan Doyle when he did a tour of the Antipodes. That was given to him when he visited Christchurch, because he visited Australia as well. But he visited Christchurch in order to give some lectures on spiritualism, and they provided him with a very nice certificate. He wrote 60 books in his lifetime, Conan Doyle I'm referring to, and 20 of them were about spiritualism. Unfortunately, you're probably aware, he lost the plot a bit and ended up being ridiculed over a most peculiar belief in fairies. I hope nobody's a believer in fairies. If you are, no offense intended. So now, going back to my comment about the scandal that really brought down Sir William, the fact of the matter is that Oscar too suffered a scandal, but he brought it on himself. His grandson, a good number of years ago, but in the 20th century, said that my grandfather, and I speak in his voice, my grandfather talked himself into prison. And that's perfectly true. So Oscar had a scandal, and there is one of the sources of the scandal. That is Oscar with Bosie, who was Lord Alfred Douglas. The name Bosie wasn't given to him by Oscar. It was a name that he had from childhood, from school or something, but That's what he was known as, Bosie. Now, Bosie got interested in Oscar when he read a picture of Dorian Gray. And if you haven't read it or even seen the film, it's certainly worth getting acquainted with. He became very interested in that, and he got friendly with Oscar, eventually very friendly. And he was in a little bit of strife. He was being blackmailed because he had written someone a letter, and the letter had some indiscreet comments in it, obviously of a lascivious nature. And he was being blackmailed, and he went to Oscar because he couldn't go to his dad. And Oscar actually gave him some money to buy his way out of the problem. That was at the beginning of 1892. By the middle of 1892, Oscar and Boise were the best of friends. Boise's father, of course, was the Marquis of Queensberry, he of the boxing rules. And that's a not very flattering image of the Marquis of Queensberry. They were descended from people known as a particular person known as Black Douglas, who in the 13th century was fighting for Scotland's freedom. The Marquis was, in fact, a militant atheist, and he'd been chucked out of the House of Lords for his anti-religious bigotry. He had a tremendous passion for pugilism, and I just referred to the rules of boxing. And his family actually thought that he was quite mad. At one point, they considered having him incarcerated in an asylum because they thought he had gone a trifle doolally. So he became aware that Oscar was having a little bit of an affair, let's call it, with his son Bosie. Bosie was described as an alabaster peeled and charming young man. And the Marquis wasn't too charmed by the fact that his son was having an affair with Oscar Wilde. And he went around. Oscar lived in a street in London, which is still there, called, I think it's pronounced Tite, T-I-T-E, Tite Street. And he went around to Oscar's house and gave him a jolly good telling off. And he said to him that if I see you with my son, he said, I don't know. Oscar said to him, are you accusing me of having unnatural relationships with your son? And he said, I'm not saying that you are, but you act like you are, you pose like you are, and you may very well. And if I see you with my son in a restaurant again, I will give you a thorough thrashing. To which Oscar said, always a man to keep the humor to the forefront. I don't know what the Queensberry rules are, but the Oscar Wilde rules are shoot on sight. Anyway, the Marquis wasn't particularly enamored by that reply, and he decided that he wasn't letting go of the matter. And Oscar's new play, Lady Windermere's Fan, if you've never seen it, it's well worth seeing. Lady Windermere's Fan was coming on for this first night, and Queensberry had decided he was going to go and throw what was described as a phallic bouquet at Oscar outside the theatre. A phallic bouquet apparently is constructed from carrots and turnips. You can only use your imagination. The theatre got wind that this was going to happen, and they put extra security on, and they managed to stop the Marquis from carrying out his little plan. But the Marquis wasn't going away easily. Now, you'll be aware of the London clubs, and Oscar was a member of the Albemarle Club. And the Marquis turned up at the Albemarle Club with his calling card. In those days, people had their calling cards, a bit like your business card today. And he left a card in for Oscar. And the card, which I think we can have a look at, that's actually a facsimile of the actual card. It says on it, for Oscar Wilde, and it says, and look carefully at the last handwritten word, posing some demight. The Marquis wasn't known for his high level of education, and he misspelled the word, but he knew what he meant. Just as a matter of interest, you'll understand when I say this, Mike, if you look at the spelling that he has on his card for Marquis, it's the other one, Marquis. Bit of an in-joke there, we'll pass on that one. So anyway, so he went to the club and he left the card accusing Oscar of being a sodomite. Fortunately, the card was seen by a waiter who slipped it into an envelope, wrote on the envelope Oscar Wilde and set it on the mantelpiece. And that's where Oscar found it. Nothing more would have happened if Oscar had just shut up. At least nothing would have happened out of that particular incident if he'd shut up. But Oscar got, excuse me, Oscar got very upset about it, and he decided that he was going to take action. And he started a libel action. And this is the action where some Freemasons come forward. So Oscar was taking a libel action against the Marquis of Queensberry, and representing Oscar was a man dear to the hearts of those of us from Northern Ireland, and there may be one or two other than me around. Sir Edward Carson, because he was instrumental in setting up the state of Northern Ireland. Whether you love him or not depends on which way you lean. But however, Sir Edward Carson represented Queensberry at the trial. Now, the thing about Edward Clark, the other fellow is Sir Edward Clark, and Sir Edward Clark was representing Wilde. The interesting thing about these fellows, bear in mind that Oscar was from Dublin, and he was a Freemason, and he went to Trinity. Guess what? The two gentlemen in front of you, or in Ireland we would say forninst you, were also of that ilk. Trinity graduates, Dubliners, and Freemasons. In actual fact, in the case of Sir Edward Carson, he grew up around the corner from where Oscar lived, and there's a pretty good chance that they played together as children, hardly in the street, I would imagine, but they would have got together as children, and they would have known each other very well. Oscar, when he heard that Edward Carson was representing Queensberry, made a comment that there's nothing like an old friend. I'm paraphrasing here, but there's nothing like an old friend to put the knife in, and that's what he expected Sir Edward Carson to do. The Irish connection gets even more intense, and the Irish connection and the Trinity connection is that the judge hearing the case was Sir Richard N, that's N with two N's, Sir Richard N. Collins, and he was also a Trinity graduate, though I couldn't find any evidence that he was a Freemason. The trial on the first day went very well for Oscar, and he was at his performing best with witticisms and making a mockery of the case and trying to be sarcastic with Sir Edward Carson. But you can tell by the set of the man's jib, looking at the photograph, he wasn't going to be taking that too easily. And he went home and he cogitated on this in the evening, and he thought, I'm going to let old Oscar have it tomorrow. So anyway, the second day, the trial took a turn for the worse. And in fact, Sir Edward had been told that Queensberry had gathered together some folk who were going to come and provide evidence that they had been hired as rent boys for Oscar. This was not a very good look for Oscar. And his lawyer, Sir Edward Carson, advised him, Sir Edward Clark, I beg your pardon, Sir Edward Clark advised him to drop the case. Now, this was not good advice, because on dropping the case, that opened up Oscar for prosecution for the case that did bring about his downfall, the case for sodomy. So it might have been better had Sir Edward Clark let the case run its natural course and see what happened there. So the next thing that happened was that, so that was the case for libel. Once it was open for Oscar to be prosecuted for sodomy, the warrant to arrest him was issued, and he was arrested at the Cadogan Hotel in London. And if you're fond of poetry, and I am, but I won't read it to you, Sir John Betjeman has written the most wonderful poem called The Arrest of Oscar Wilde at the Cadogan Hotel. So the trial went ahead, and guess what? Oscar didn't lose. How did he wind up in jail? It's quite amazing. Well, it was a hung jury, right? So the case was finished, a hung jury. It could have ended there, but unfortunately for Oscar, the Solicitor General, Sir Frank Lockwood, decided he was going to take another case, and a second case was taken. And this is where it gets interesting for me as a Freemason and as a Northern Irish person, because dear old Ned, as he was called, Ned Carson, has carried a very heavy burden all of these years, because people who are fond of Oscar Wilde, and I rank myself among them on an intellectual level, have always blamed him for Oscar's demise. But the actual truth of the matter is, Sir Edward Carson went to the Solicitor General and said, he's suffered enough, don't take another case. By this stage, of course, public interest is absolutely pumping. And he was afraid, the Solicitor General was afraid of being accused of corruption. And he decided to take the case. It must have been difficult for him, because his own nephew was also a homosexual as well. And he ended up doing a runner to Europe. So anyway, and also Carson said that Carson was asked, how is it that you could take a case against your friend in the Liable case, Freemason, your friend? And Edward Carson said that he always regretted having taken the brief in the Liable case. So he's criticized, in my opinion, too harshly. So the trial went ahead, and dear old Oscar, I'm afraid, got the worst of it. One of the interesting things about one of the upshots of the case is that Oscar was, of course, shunned by society after this, and his old school, which is in Ireland, there were what are called royal schools. I think there were 4 of them in different provinces. My own nephew, these are public schools. And when you say public school in Britain, you don't mean public. The public can't afford to go. they're very private schools like Eton and such like. But the 4 royal schools were of that ilk. And Oscar went to one in Enniskillen called Pretoria Royal, to which my own nephew went as well. And when Oscar became shunned, they took his name off the honours list, of the honours board. Now, I mentioned to you, well, that's just the public showing. What you're looking at there is an image from the press at the time, a drawing showing the public interest in the second trial of Wilde, and Wilde being shunted to court in the Black Maria, as it was called, a horse-drawn thing. So that's that bit. Now, what we're looking, I mentioned to you that there were similarities in the cases between the case of his parents and his own case. And what you're looking at there is, again, the thing in the paper that we saw earlier, where Mary Josephine Travers was taking Lady Wilde and Sir William Wilde to court on a liable case. Oscar says, of course, the advantage of emotions is that they lead us astray. And if ever that was true, it was true with him. So the case went to court, and Oscar, of course, lost the case, and he ended up being sentenced to 2 years with hard labor. And it was hard labor. They had the old prison treadmills in those days, and he was on it for quite some time. He was badly treated by the management, let's call it that, of the prison in the first instance. But there was a change of governor, and the governor took a lot of sympathy with Oscar, because I think I believe it from my reading that he was a great fan of Oscar's writings, and he allowed Oscar to have lots of books and things like that. One of the other, so he went to jail in Dublin, sorry, not Dublin, in London. And one of the interesting things about when he went to jail, his mother, Lady Jane, became very ill. She had a bronchial infection, and indeed, she believed correctly that she was going to die. And she asked if she could visit Oscar in prison, and it was denied. And Oscar said afterwards, bearing in mind their interest in the occult, Oscar said afterwards that at the point he believed his mother died, her shade, as it was called, her spectre, appeared in his cell. Now, you can choose to believe that or not, but Oscar said that it happened. And I think that is quite interesting. So that was the demise of Oscar. He was brought down. The things which brought him down were his own arrogance. And that was when I say there were similarities in the cases. So you had the abuse of a young person by an older man, in the case of the father, Mary, in the case of Oscar Posey. And you also had the arrogance and ego that was fueling the cases as well. Oscar Wilde is buried in very good company in a tomb, and that's an image of the tomb, in Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, which I've referred to before when I spoke of Marshall Ney. And as I said before, if you're going to be buried anywhere and you like good company, that's the one to be in. A bit like Highgate in London, I suppose. And that, I think, I put that little image with him sitting there in the saying. I think that's a lovely thing, actually. It says, death must be so beautiful, to lie on the soft brown earth, with the grasses waving above one's head, and listen to silence. I have no yesterday, to have no yesterday, and no tomorrow, to forget time, to forget life, to be at peace. Oscar Wilde. Modern times, well, things have moved on. Wilde was posthumously pardoned in 2017. They're under the United Kingdom's Policing and Crimes Act. It's called the Turing Law. That was Alan Turing, the scientist and athlete who committed suicide when he was about to be prosecuted for being gay. His school, Pretoria Royal, has now reinstated his name on the honours list, and they kind of dine out on it now, to use the expression. Oscar was the victim of his own ego and the time he lived in. And all Freemasons can be proud to call Oscar and his father brothers. And Irish Freemasons can also call them fellow countrymen. Gentlemen, that is my offering to you this evening.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jack. We'll move into some discussions and so on. If the rest of you will just keep yourself muted just for a moment. Jack, do you want to come out of that? Stop your screen sharing. You can, and then we can. That's good. Yes, excellent. Well done. So we've got everybody back. Before we have some general discussion, I would just like to say, if there is someone from the Dunedin Research Lodge, then we would be very happy if they want to say a few words. But before that, I'm going to tell you about Jack's book, The Ramble Around the Pillars. He has just given us one of the talks amongst the 8. If you enjoy that, there are 7 more that are just as good. We have ensured that these books are all sent to all of the hosts, all of the research lodges throughout New Zealand. And by the way, Ian Green, we've sent 10 of them over to Australia and Brendan Kine is going to have those, so you can have some over there as well. We're selling them here in New Zealand for $30. We're not going to charge you, they won't be charged any postage to the hosts, but if you buy them, if they go and you want to get some directly from us, then we will have to charge you the postage. So by far the best way is to get it from your local research lodge. So are we all ready? Now, I've just given you a few moments, Jack, there just to catch your breath and have a drink. Are you okay now for us to go in our Q&A?
Yes.
Right. So firstly, is there anybody from the Dunedin Research Lodge that wants to say a few words?
Yeah.
You have to say something, then I see you on my screen. Where are you?
Hi, Mike. Glenn Summerhays here.
There you are. Got you. Right.
Worship Master of the Research Lodge. On behalf of Otago, what a great lecture that was. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Sorry that you're not down here. We had some great weather for you. Unfortunately, it wasn't today. It was snowing on the hills and a maximum of 8. I know you would have loved it if you were here. But we're keeping a warm seat for you, Jack, when you come down next year for the ANZ MRC conference in November next year. We're looking forward to it. So on behalf of the Research Lodge, I know Alan Jackson's here. Thoroughly enjoyed that lecture and thank you very much. And we are looking forward to seeing you in person for some Dunedin hospitality.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm certainly looking forward to coming down.
Yes. Thank you, Glenn. Now, if you want to say something or you want to ask a question, the easiest way, you can put your hand up, but I can't always see because I've got 2 pages. But if you say something, then it's illuminated and then I can see that somebody is wanting to say something. So do we have anybody that wants to make a comment or question?
I'd like to say something.
Great. David.
Yeah, interested in your comment about banshees, because I think the banshees have come to Australia. My great aunts used to when someone was died in the family, they used to hear the banshees, and they didn't know who this was, but they knew someone had, and they were in Wilde. It's about 110 miles from Canberra, and it's an Irish town in a way. They had both Catholics and Protestants over on the Protestant side, but the banshees did come to Australia. So
You know, when I struggled when I was putting the name of the banshee, because I was going to write it in Irish, because it doesn't look at all like banshee, and then I thought to myself, oh, no, I'll have to spend too long explaining it, so I put the English interpretation of it.
How's it spelled? How's it spelled?
It depends whether it's plural or singular, but singular is B-E-A-N. It looks like bean, but that's ban. And SI with what we call a fada over the I is sheep. When you see the fada, it's like when you see Sean or Seamus or Siobhan, you wonder, how's it a sh? That's because there's a fada over it, and it depends on where it's a long vowel or a short vowel, but I can be very boring about it. We'll leave it at that.
Okay, you are.
I'd like to make a little comment, if I may. First of all, I'm so pleased to have been able to get here today. I've still got my pseudo work clothes on. A little comment that rang a bell with me for Tasmania, if I may. Oscar Fingal of Flarty Wills Wilde. We had a lodge in Tasmania in the town of Fingal named Lord Carrington, and I thought that's a most interesting connection you brought forward for me tonight.
Called Lord Carrington.
Yes.
I'm not quite sure what the connection is. What's the connection?
It seemed to me interesting that there's Fingal, Lord Carrington. Is there a connection? The two just worked.
I see. I can't comment on that.
Yeah.
You might be interested, Jack, about the Apollo Lodge. I have been there, and it's a very, very interesting and energetic lodge, of course, because there are many at the Oxford University, and the old boys go back there. When they have a lodge meeting, they do two ceremonies, like the Isaac Newton, the Cambridge Lodge, two ceremonies in the same night. So they'll start with a second or a third. They'll do that to perfection, as you would expect. And they do it with 5 candidates all at once. And then they'll have a coffee break, and they'll do an initiation. This is so the initiate doesn't have to wait, they can come later. They will do an initiation to perfection with 5 candidates all at once. And then they have a marvelous dinner where there's a lot of shouting and singing and banging and crashing, and it's so good. It's full of energy, full of life, but all done extremely well. If you ever get the chance, but by the way, they do wear court dress. The officers wear court dress, and quite a few of them have quite long hair because they're young boys, young guys. So they look a bit like Oscar. If you ever get the chance to go there, jump at it.
Do they still meet in the pub in the hotel that I had on display?
I was trying to think where we meet or where they met. It's a hotel thing now, isn't it? And I'm not,
It is.
sure it's called the same thing anymore.
The Randolph Hotel.
I think they still meet there.
They've moved around, yeah.
It's literally just around the corner from the Institute of Archaeology.
Right.
Oh, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just that when I was researching it, I came across a newspaper article which seemed to imply the hotel had been taken over and was changing its name.
Ah, right.
Well, the Randolph Hotel in Oxford is quite famous for its afternoon teas. I've been there quite a few times. Jack, you mentioned Oscar Wilde going to jail in London. We were always brought up to believe that he went to jail in Reading Jail.
At first, and then he was shifted.
So he went to jail twice, did he?
No, he was shifted. I'm not entirely certain. You may have me on this point, but I have a feeling he was shifted jails at one point.
Oh.
Yeah, but I need to check that, George. Yeah.
Okay, that was really good, Jack. Thank you very much for that.
But if you haven't, I'm a poetry enthusiast, so please don't hold that against me. But if you have an opportunity to read Sir John Betjeman's poem, The Arrest of Oscar Wilde at the Cadogan Hotel, it's really terrific.
There's a story in my old school, the John Rowan School in Greenwich, that Dorian Gray's real name was Dorian White. And Oscar Wilde took up with this young schoolboy and led him astray into all sorts of drug dens and things in the night, much to the schoolmaster's absolute horror.
Yeah.
So he actually went to school in Greenwich in London.
Yeah, yeah.
More questions? More
A
comments?
lot of the problem that surrounded Wilde and later on surrounded Alan Turing was the fact that homosexuality was illegal.
Legal.
Absolutely.
And it was illegal in a strange way, in the sense that when the law was put to Queen Victoria to sign, men and women were included in the legislation. But Queen Victoria thought that women couldn't possibly do the actions which would require them if they were homosexual. And so lesbianism wasn't an illegal practice. It was just a male illegality.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I think that's the time, and nice to see you, Alan. We've been communicating, I think. I think that's the point at which Queen Victoria made some comment about not frightening the horses.
Could have been too.
Yeah, she said she didn't mind. She didn't mind what would happen with them as long as they didn't frighten the horses.
The other thing, Oscar wrote the Ballad of Reading Jail when he was incarcerated, and that in itself is a good read. Part of his punishment was making oakum, which was combination of rope and tar to put in the gaps in the ship's planks to keep the ships waterproof. And because he was a bit of a dilettante, his hands weren't ready for it. It absolutely ruined him.
Yeah.
And then later on, he moved out of polite society and moved to France, where he became bloated, dissolute, drug taking, and an absolute shadow of his former self. It's such a shame.
I didn't say anything about Bosie in the sort of after-match function after that, and I'll say something about that now if I could. But in relation to the Ballad of Reading Jail, the only bit of it, I did it for A-level, I think. The only bit of it that I can remember is the little bit which says, that little patch of blue that prisoners call the sky, because he could just see out of a little window in his cell. But Bosie, after Oscar was released from prison, attended the Shannon, and he made comments. He made comments because Oscar was obviously pestering him for money when he was released, and Bosie is said to have made comments about him being fat and useless and such like, and he even described Oscar's asking him for cash as being like prostitution.
Yeah, he's a great friend of Lily Langtry, who was a friend of the Prince of Wales. He moved in those circles until he let himself go. Great shame. We presumably, did the Freemasons kick him out?
Yes, for non-payment of dues.
Ah, right. Thank you.
Not for homosexuality. He was kicked out long before that.
Okay.
That's the usual reason why we kick people out, isn't it? Because they don't pay their subs. They do the most terrible, outrageous things, and we keep them in, but they don't pay their subs and they're out. Yeah. Well, there you go. This Alan Turing's house was just near Hampton Court, and there's the park, Bushy Park, and all that area, and his house is just there with a blue plaque. And of course, he's yet another one. Brilliant people who made such advances for humankind, who are brought down because of their sexual preferences, all of which have, of course, changed. But the lies that people often had to lead, which included, by the way, some Grand Masters of UGLE, but we won't go into that tonight.
I think you'll find T.S. Eliot skated around the edges too.
Yes, I think so also. Yeah.
More questions, comments?
Jack,
All right. Gary?
I have a question for you from left field.
Yes, Gary, far away.
Being a past grad lecturer, I'm adept at nosing around at things. And I came across a YouTube program the other day that thought, oh, this looks interesting. It was by a Jesuit priest who was decrying the fact that you cannot be a Catholic and a Freemason. And one of his comments was that you couldn't be a Catholic and a Freemason because of the secrecy. And I don't, quote, I don't belong to any secret organizations myself, he said. And then went on to say, he was, however, of a member of a lodge, which I've looked for tonight and can't find it, but you might know. I think it was called the Knights of St. Cuthbert. Do you know anything about them?
The Knights of St. Columbanus.
Yep.
I think that's what you mean.
Right. And they're a secret organization, aren't they? Secret Catholic organization.
Yes,
Correct?
and it was set up in direct response to a priest set it up because Protestant Irish folks were going to their fraternal club, so to speak.
Correct.
And he set that up in Ireland to accommodate Catholics who wanted to go for fellowship outside of a completely religious environment. And in fact, some of my friends, I taught up at the border in Northern Ireland in a place called Downpatrick. And I'm Protestant. There were 10% of us, so we were well outnumbered. And a number of my colleagues at the college were in the Knights of St. Columbanus.
It's an interesting situation where you get Jesuit priests saying they don't do this, and then suddenly you find out they do something else.
It's not unusual. It's not the first time.
Just an interesting comment, Jack. As I say, past grad lecturers, bad news for diving into things where they shouldn't be.
Yes, interesting. You might be interested, Jack, that this anti-gay thing, which we thought had long since gone away, hasn't. About 4 years ago, a new Grand Master of the state of Georgia in the United States, not the Georgia that David Cincinnati, who's down there, is part of, announced publicly that gays, adulterers, and fornicators were no longer welcome in Freemasonry, which of course was completely illegal, even with the laws of Georgia. But I said in an article that I did, I could figure out, but could never quite figure out what you have to do to be a fornicator. You know, what's the requirement? Anyway, and I remember talking to some of the boys in Georgia, and they said, "Oh, he'll be gone next year, so we'll, that'll be fine."
Did you have to be all three, or it was just one?
That's what I wondered. Yes, had to be all three.
I have no expertise here.
No.
Robert Burns has got an excellent poem which ends up with "I am a fornicator."
Very nice.
Perhaps we could run a course in it or something.
Dear God.
Yeah, I have not necessarily so much of a question. I've actually got a book, several books on notable historical trials, and which has all three of Oscar Wilde's, including
Yes.
some of the transcripts.
Yes.
2 points I'd like to make after reading the transcripts, and was from memory until I grabbed my book, is the judge talk about being railroaded. The judge was definitely not on the side of not passing down the middle, as I should say.
Yeah.
The other thing too is the fact that there's a note in here that it suggested that because the trial was led by the Solicitor General,
Yes.
Sir Frank Lodwood, it actually was that the government had determined that he should be prosecuted rather than just individuals by then.
Yeah. No doubt that, but by that stage, the public interest was such that the government was definitely involved, but the buck stopped on the Solicitor General's desk in a sense to execute that. And that's the one. Sir Edward Carson is reported to have approached, in his own autobiography, he said that he had approached the Solicitor General to try and prevent it, because he got annoyed later in life. He got upset that he was being criticized so much for bringing old Oscar down. And he said he tried not to, he said he wished he hadn't got involved in the libel trial, but having realized what was happening, he thought he would try and ameliorate the situation and failed.
Yes, in fact, that's noted here as well.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, all these sorts of, they've got the background quite well described, and very much in line with what you were saying as well.
Yeah, if you didn't mind flicking me an email with the title of that, if you could.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
I was fascinated, Jack, by the two daughters whose dresses catch fire, which was a very common occurrence of people, going on fire with the open fires and whatever, but how quickly they must have gone into flames and then they die. I mean, it's almost unheard. It must have been highly inflammable, whatever it was that they were wearing.
Well, I don't know what crinoline's made of, but I think that's what the substance was in those days, but I'm purely guessing.
The number of people in those days who burned, were kicked to death by horses, or all sorts of terrible things. We forget all of this, just how dangerous life could, gas and so on came in, how dangerous life could be in those days.
I was very nearly dispatched in a similar way myself this week when it was pouring with rain and I brought the recycling bin in, thinking we'll shelter it in the drive. I'm sitting having a cup of tea and my wife says, Jack, the bin lorry's outside. So I rush out. I had to chase the bloody thing up the road. As I'm bending in to push the bin in, the great mechanism came down and narrowly missed hitting me on the head. I said, it's very dangerous living up here.
Right, comments, questions? You're quiet, Brendan.
Yeah, no, it's a topic I don't really have a lot to say about, really. Found it interesting nonetheless, not knowing a lot about the trials of the Wilde family. Riveting story. And yeah, I was stunned by the two daughters who burnt to death. It was just, I suppose that would have put a bit of a downer on the rest of the evening, wouldn't it? The ball wouldn't have continued, but I just find that horrific. I mean, we have horrible deaths today. But
don't you have quite a lot of Irish lodges in Western Australia? Is it Western Australia?
No, they're Scottish.
Oh, they're Scottish, are they? Do they have Irish lodges at all in
there's one left in South Australia.
Yeah.
And there might be one in Queensland. Don't quote me on that.
Right. We've got 4 in New Zealand still remaining.
Definitely one in South Australia.
Yeah.
Quite a few Scottish scattered around the place.
Yes.
I take the view that when you go to live in another country, and no offense to anyone who's in another constitution, but when you go to live in another country, you need to sort of get in with them. I can't see the point of not being a member of the New Zealand Constitution.
We kept an English lodge here in Melbourne, primarily at the time, so Englishmen could also keep their English Grand rank. Because once they join the new Grand Lodge, they lose all their previous Grand rank. So the whole point of keeping Lodge Combermere was they could have both.
Yeah. Okay, no, fair enough. There's reasons I know that. Yeah.
And it still exists today.
And when it's a cold, miserable winter over there in Ireland or Scotland, and the Antipodes calls where the sun is shining, it's very good reason to go visiting in somewhere else where it's summer. That's all part of it, I suspect.
A young Scotsman here, who's the master of our Scottish lodge here in Melbourne, went back home recently before the pandemic. And he said, because he's got a really thick Scottish accent, and he wandered into his local pub and the barman said, "What sort of accent's that you've got?" And he explained he was a local and he'd been to Australia, and the publican's response was, "What the fuck are you doing back here?"
I think John Belton was there. I didn't realise that he was in. John, did I see you?
Yes,
You're
he
probably
is.
you're on the other page, right? Oh, there you are. Right.
Yes, I'm there.
Didn't
Oh,
you?
what a super talk.
Didn't you include something on Irish masonry in your talks? Wasn't there something?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you can't, if you're honest, you can't get away from Irish Freemasonry in the total picture of things. It played an enormous role.
Absolutely.
And in fact, it's the Kilwinning Knights Templar Lodge that was responsible for spreading KT round the whole of Britain.
Right. The Irish, of course, are the oldest Grand Lodge in the world, aren't they?
No.
Yes,
No.
they are. Yes, they are.
You have to qualify that they're the oldest continuous because
Well,
Yeah.
you see, that's right.
That's different, yes.
Our ancients and moderns ceased to exist in 1813, and they formed a new Grand Lodge.
Yeah.
Whereas the Irish had existed since what? Was it 1725 or something?
it is, yes, that's correct.
That's
yeah.
pretty
Yes. But don't forget, Ireland had a problem where it merged two Grand Lodges as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very common, this. And Scotland did exactly the same with Kilwinning and the Grand Lodge of Scotland.
Yeah.
Because Kilwinning joined up at the beginning, then left in a huff, and didn't come back till, what was it, 1804?
Yeah.
The only issue is what date did these things happen. I think it is correct to say that Ireland is the oldest continuous because of the date that the mergers happened in the other places.
Yeah.
Talking with Jack about all these things, the influence of the Irish throughout the world in all sorts of spheres has been enormous, and in the world of Freemasonry has been enormous as well. And of course, Rick Berman talks about the spread of Freemasonry in North America, which was very much an Irish phenomenon in many ways, wasn't it? So fantastic, really. Anyway.
One thing I forgot to do was to acknowledge the work that worshipful brother Yasha Beresiner, is that how you pronounce it?
Yasha Beresiner.
Yeah, him, because he's done a bit of writing on Oscar Wilde as well, and I must admit that it influenced some of the writing that I was doing. Yeah.
Well, just say something else about the Irish Freemasonry. They were the ones that gave a lot of warrants to the military when the English lodges wouldn't, when Grand Lodge of England wouldn't. So the Irish were actually responsible for sending Freemasonry around via the military.
I referred to that in one of my previous lectures, and I described them as perambulatory warrants, where they were allowed, the military were given them, and they were able to take them to wherever they were based. And the same thing applied in France.
Yeah, I think the easy way of looking at that is the English ruled the empire, the Scots managed it, and the Irish fought for it. so whatever it was, the Irish were everywhere. There was always a regiment. Often it would either be Irish or it would have an Irish warrant. So the influence was absolutely huge, and that's how the influence got across to the States.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Right. Any more questions or comments?
Mike Connell Townsend here.
Hello,
Can I just sort of a bit of a question to Jack and a comment? Look, my word, I enjoyed that. But, who cannot enjoy the two Wildes? And I confess, I realised suddenly I've actually visited the graves of both the father and the son in Dublin and in Père Lachaise. I seem to recall Oscar's grave is covered with lipstick kisses. It's a very strange place. Just
some of them even left by women.
Some of them even left by women, Jack. I know, it's a miracle. Drifting back to your Masonic references with the two pillars and the B&J and St. John the Baptist, I had this something clicked, and I remembered there was Ken Russell made a film of Salome, of course, by Oscar Wilde, the play, in 1988. I'm just curious if you ever seen it,
No.
because it's all about with Glenda Jackson of Stratford Johns, who was in Z Cars and so on. And I always thought Stratford Johns was a very straightforward-looking police superintendent, but playing an extremely camp owner of a brothel in London in this movie, Salome's Last Dance, with Glenda Jackson. And of course, the Salome with her famous cry, "Bring me the head of St. John the Baptist." If anyone hasn't seen it, I don't know if it's on YouTube. I really recommend it. It's one of the most bent, weird, strange, incredibly funny films I've ever seen. But maybe Oscar just had this sort of thing about St. John the Baptist and beheadings. I'm not sure, but I do recommend the film.
I don't think that's the case, Conal. I think that he was the victim of a prank. I think that his Masonic brethren, realizing he was a greenhorn, spun him that yarn, and he decided to regurgitate it.
Fair enough. Yeah. But Jack, really appreciated it tonight. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Great lecture.
Yes, you think that if Oscar had only lived a little later, he would probably be would have written the scripts for the Carry On films, I suppose, where there was plenty of camp going on, and it's all, the English and British love the sort of camp humor and whatever. But in his day, no, it wasn't such a good thing.
When I was at college, they used to put on plays, and the first one I saw, though I can't for the life of me remember what the gist of it was Sir Arthur Saville's Crime. Are you familiar with that one? Sir Arthur Saville's Crime, not Jimmy Savile's Crime. That's another story. But that was one of his early ones, and the Students' Union always liked to put that on for the freshers. So it must have some appeal.
Well, you've got us going now. We must read some of his plays and some of his writings, because an awful lot of things get ascribed to Oscar Wilde, don't they? If you can say, wasn't it Oscar Wilde who said? Usually it wasn't. But I must read some more of his. I remember how much I enjoyed the picture of Dorian Gray, and the idea that you could have this picture in the attic and it got older and you didn't. I must read it again and figure out it didn't end well. I can remember that. I think you sell your soul, don't you, in order to do that? But there you go. Okay, everybody, any more questions or comments before we wind it up?
I just sorry, my speaker wasn't working for a start. I think the cat had been playing leapfrogs amongst the wiring. So I've got that working now. But going back to old Oscar Wilde, I see that one of his plays was An Ideal Husband, which is a bit of a paradox, it seems, with old Oscar.
Actually, not so much of a paradox. Of course, he was not the ideal husband, but up until the wheels fell off, he was actually not particularly bad in his time. And according to the writings about him, shortly after his demise, it was good to his children, etc. But clearly, one couldn't defend the life that he led. But he wasn't a horrible person. I think he's, as I said earlier, he was a victim of both his ego and his time.
Yeah. Well, if anybody was going to be an ideal husband, his father William, he sort of moved around a little bit there too. So I don't know how he got on with his actual wife. He had a few affairs from all accounts.
Are you speaking about Sir William?
William, yes.
His wife, I think, from what I've read, and I've read quite a bit about it, his wife came to be accepting about it. I think the business with Mary Travers, given her age and such like, just got a little too much for her. And that's why she kind of got wound up and went to speak to the father. But Sir William had been, to use the local vernacular, had been putting it about for quite a bit. And I think she was just she had accommodated herself to it.
Yes. Okay, everybody. Well, I think we've just about got there. I want to remind you of two things. Firstly, on Thursday, with the same link, the same time, Jack will be giving his final talk, which is chapter 8 in his book, which is William Butler Yeats, The Mystic and the Influence of Freemasonry. I'm particularly looking forward to that. And also, just to say, don't forget to get yourself a copy of Jack's book. It's an excellent read. There are 8 good stories. You've heard one of them tonight. It's full color and it's nice large type, easy to read for old eyes. So please get yourself a copy of this, because in fact this tour has cost the hosts nothing so far, because of course there isn't any travel or accommodation, etc. So this is the way that we can keep these tours and these things running. So apart from that, I hope we will see you all next Thursday for Jack's final talk. Jack, thank you again for an excellent talk. And I think we can probably stop the recording. George, are you